So today, as you've already noticed, I'm sure, the first Sunday of Black History Month, and I think I've probably mentioned before, probably more than once, that I majored in history in university. And it actually took me 5 years to get through university because I kept changing my major. And when I first enrolled, I actually enrolled as a music major because my father wanted me to be a concert organist. But when it came to time to actually go to university up in Oregon, my father had the flu and wasn't able to drive me up there, so I took the bus on my own. And when I got there, I distinctly remember walking around the campus that first day and having a sudden epiphany that there was no one within about 500 miles to tell me what to do. I was going to have to make all of my own decisions, and at first I found that thought terrifying, and then I realized how freeing it was, and so I decided to major in psychology. And a year into that, I realized that it wasn't for me, and I changed schools and changed majors, and this is really ironic considering what a techno-peasant I am now. I majored in computer programming. Yeah, Duncan's back there laughing at me. Yeah, for the record, every single thing I learned back then is now completely obsolete, relegated to the dustbin of history. Anybody remember having to program with punch cards? And God help you if you dropped them and they got out of order, and you fed them into a computer the size of a whole room with less memory than my cell phone. Times change. It was an interesting course of study, but I went into it because I thought, oh, this would be a great way to make a living, and it probably would have been, but I eventually decided I did not want to make my life around it. Also, I was doing it because I had a boyfriend who was a computer programmer, and for obvious reasons, many things then did not work out. And I thought I should really do what I love, and love who I love. And I switched to yet another university and majored in history. I love history. I love history. Sometimes I feel like history explains everything. You're probably familiar with the famous saying of George Santayana that those who do not remember the past are doomed to repeat it. And around the history department at Dominican University, we had a saying, the reason history keeps repeating itself is because no one listened the first time, or the second time, or the 100th time. And as the writer of Ecclesiastes reminds us, there is nothing new under the sun. That was actually the first phrase I ever learned in Hebrew, and I've never forgotten it. Ein chadash takat hashemesh. There is nothing new under the sun. And we do keep repeating ourselves, and we need to remember that. And the passage that James read from Exodus tells some of the story of the Passover, the account of the deliverance of the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt. And the passage says that you are to remember this story and to tell it forever, to tell it to your children, to tell it as if you yourself, no matter how many generations removed, as if you yourself had been enslaved and then freed. Now, the title of this lesson for life is, What's Past is Prologue. Anybody recognize that phrase? It's not from the Bible, it's Shakespeare. I know people get them confused. It's a quote from The Tempest, Act 2, Scene 1, and it means that the past sets the context for the present and can help determine future actions. Now, in The Tempest, when Antonio says this line, what's past is prologue, he's trying to justify his intended actions, to justify committing murder with his friend Sebastian, suggesting that their past actions have somehow inevitably led them to this moment. And the phrase can be interpreted in a positive or negative way. The negative interpretation is that the past repeats itself because we don't learn from our mistakes, and I think we can see some of that. But a more positive interpretation is that the past prepares us for future opportunities. Yes, when we remember the past, I think we sometimes focus on all of the horrible things that have gone on in history. And as a history major, I sometimes think that the way we teach history contributes to that. We study great battles and wars. We study the conflicts, the assassinations, the genocides, the rise and fall of brutal empires. Because no matter the supposedly good intentions of those who build empires, they always degenerate into brutality, and they always fall violently. And we would do well in our remembering also to remember the words of Mahatma Gandhi, who said, "Remember that all through history there have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they seem invincible, but in the end they always fall." Think of it, always. Now, I'm not going to go into politics, but as a transplanted American, I can tell you that that is something I am really focusing on these days. For a time, they seem invincible, but in the end, they always fall. Now, last week was Holocaust Remembrance Day, and that is a horrific memory, a generational trauma that we must never, ever forget. And yet, the rise or resurgence of anti-Semitism has skyrocketed in recent years. And especially during Black History Month, we think of the horrific legacy of slavery. And, Bentley, I had in here the alarmingly profitable and hugely immoral slave trade, and I took out the profitable part. So I'm glad you mentioned that it occurred because it made people money. It made people money to purchase the misery of millions of people. And that's another generational trauma with repercussions that have rippled their way down through history and shaped our present day. And we are constantly seeing how the racism of the past is still the racism of the present, and racists will always find new ways to divide us, new ways to oppress people to whom they mistakenly feel superior. The racism of the past is still the racism of the present, and it is up to us to make it not the racism of the future. Because as much as some people want to forget that history, we must never ever forget that either. But remembering these things, remembering that the past that is prologue for our present and for our future can also lead us, with God's help, to create a better world. And before church, I was talking to Brent, and he was reminding me, even though he didn't know what my sermon was about, that times like this are a terrific opportunity to create something better, to create a better world, because this is the time to build a movement. Amen? Amen. And sometimes the lessons of the past seem very harsh. And as a perpetual student of history, which always seems to focus on the worst in human existence, the remembering can be painful. The Black Death, a bubonic plague pandemic, killed an estimated 50 people in Europe alone in less than a decade in the 14th century. And that was roughly 50% of the population of some parts of Europe. Estimates of the number of people who died in the world wars and the assorted genocides of the 20th century range from 170 million to 360 million people. That's an entire nation, a big one. And the 20th century is considered by historians to be the bloodiest century in human existence, and I pray we never surpass that. But that's what history teaches us. And in hard times, we have to remember that the light always returns. Remember our earlier dark nights of the soul for ourselves and our families and our nations, when we fell into holes we thought were too deep to get out of, and yet we did. And in the words of the wonderful African-American poet Maya Angelou, every storm runs out of rain, Every storm runs out of rain. The sun always comes out again. Every winter turns to spring. So remember the oppression of slavery and of oppression and discrimination, and remember the oppression of the Hebrew people in Egypt. Remember that they stood on the brink of the Red Sea with ocean waves before them and Pharaoh's murderous army behind them, and remember how God made a way out of no way. Remember the Middle Passage of slavery, the slave trade, where nearly 4 million enslaved people died in that horrific trade. And then remember the activism of the Civil Rights era, the courage of Viola Davis, the Greensboro sit-ins, the march from Selma to Montgomery, the March on Washington, where we heard of Martin's dream. Remember the more recent history of our community, the bathhouse raids. Now, Cheryl told me before church that she remembers being at the bathhouse raids, not the raids, the protests afterwards. Sorry, the protests afterwards. I knew I was going to get that wrong. I was going to say, anybody else been at the protests? I don't want to know if you were in the bathhouse. Protests? Anybody? Yeah, all righty. Thank you. Remember the pandemic. Remember, and then remember the coronavirus vaccine. Remember the frontline heroes who got us through. This is why history is so important. Remember and learn. That's why Black History Month is so important, because the past is indeed prologue. The past, for good or for ill, has shaped our present, and if you can stomach a look at the present, then just look at the political chaos and cruelty of our current day, and then look for ways in which we can fight to create a better world than the one for which the past has prepared us. This is the time to build a better world, because history is not destiny. History is not destiny. The past is the past. It's not our future if we don't want it to be. Remember that quote from Shakespeare's play? When Antonio says the past is prologue, he seems to think that all of his actions in the past have made his future actions inevitable, but he was wrong, because history is not destiny. Looking at the present shows us what we have to overcome. But remembering our past shows us that so many times we have overcome. The journey isn't over, and there are victories along the way. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, still progress. And at the beginning of our service, we sang a beautiful song, which has been called the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. And it contains some good lessons for us. Sing a song full of the faith that the harsh past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. And further, we have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out of the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. And if we are to learn from the lessons of history, we need to focus on the stars. We may be stuck in the mud sometimes, but we don't have to stay there. We can and must reach for the stars. Reach for the white gleam of the bright stars of freedom and equality and community. Reach for a whole constellation of bright stars of love and justice and human dignity. And remember, never forget that God has done it before, and God will do it again. Amen.